Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Janell Blue, past president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, and who is also a sponsor of this program. And today our guest is my co-host, Chuck Mason. Chuck is an expert on New Jersey in particular, but the Mid-Atlantic States. And so we're going to talk today about founding the colonies, settling the land in the Mid-Atlantic States. Welcome, Chuck.
Thank you, Janell, for having me.
So just to clarify, now what are we talking about when we say Mid-Atlantic States?
Okay, the Mid-Atlantic States are New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware.
And what makes the research there unique from, let's say, New England?
Well, New England, you had the Puritans and the Pilgrims coming in and settling the land, and really not a whole lot of the area really had anybody else there prior to them, other than like the Indians and things. Where the Mid-Atlantic States, you had a number of countries that came in from Europe and settled the land before you end up with the British coming in and kind of taking over everything. And so the way the land was granted was different from the way it was granted in New England or the southern states, so Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And you had two ways that it was actually granted to people. It was granted to noblemen like William Penn, or it was granted to men who the king appointed as his agents.
You had to, if you knew somebody. Huh?
You knew somebody. So you had two different ways that the land was granted, and so that kind of makes it unique. We did this, or we did at the Fairfax conference, probably around 2005. We had someone who did the New England colonial research, how to find things there. And one of the comments we had from people was, well, I have people in anything below New York and below. And so a couple of years later, I decided, okay, I'll tackle the Mid-Atlantic States and hope that somebody would do the Southern, but nobody has. But I found that it was definitely a much different record-keeping system and the way the land was doled out to people and all. And so that creates a totally different situation in that group of states.
In what to look for, in what to search for, and your expectations. And you're mighty experienced in this because your ancestry is all from that area, right?
Well, mine is Pennsylvania on my mother's side and New Jersey on my father's side. But I have a few that wandered into New York, and I have a few that have wandered down into Maryland. I didn't really have and still haven't found anybody in Delaware, but I've done some work for some people in Delaware whose ancestors started out in Pennsylvania or New Jersey and wandered down there. So I had kind of, when I put this together, I had kind of worked in 4 of the 5 states. I hadn't really touched on New York, but it was fairly easy to pull together the information that I needed to be able to present it.
So a lot of people say, oh my gosh, I've hit the brick wall. And is that really a brick wall, or can that be overcome?
Not usually. I mean, people think they hit brick walls, and when you start questioning them, they may not understand the records, or they may not know where to go and look for records. And so sometimes what they need to do is change their strategy, or, particularly going back in colonial times, we have fewer records to look for.
And what would those records be?
They're looking for, say, census records. Well, colonial times, we didn't have census records. So you get into the records that were created at that time. Number one is church records. And you have a big mix of religions in the Mid-Atlantic States. So you have Quakers, you have Methodists, you have Baptists, you have Presbyterians, and the list goes on. You have Catholics. So it's looking at the church records, knowing what churches were around at the time, and have the records survived. Not every church has their records survived. Like, Baptists, I find, are one of the most difficult because the records are not considered or weren't considered records of the church. They were the minister's records.
Oh,
so he took off.
Yeah, could be in their attic somewhere.
Could be anywhere. Where, like the Methodist church that I grew up in, the records are the churches. Although they did early on have the circuit riding ministers until a church grew enough, or an area grew enough to establish a church. But you still have a lot of those records.
And also, many of the churches would have merged at some point. And so then who took over the records and what did they do with them?
And that can be problematic if you can't track those down. Another type of record, and of course this is from the very beginning, the land records. They started immediately when land went out of the ownership of the crown. Then the colony started keeping records of the land, of the sales and things like that.
Are there some of those crown records in the UK or in other places too?
A lot of, for the colonial things, what I have found in the Mid-Atlantic States, they started keeping the records and the colony ended up with them.
Okay.
Now, New Jersey kind of has a unique situation where they had the East Jersey and West Jersey proprietorship.
Oh,
And
what's
so
that?
they were selling off the land. Well, you had two men who were granted land.
Right.
And in England, when they looked at the map of New Jersey, they thought it faced as Long Island did. So instead of running north to south like the state actually runs, the maps, they turned and run them east to west. And so you have a diagonal that is, or was, kind of from the northeast to the southwest when they turned the map, but in reality it's from the northwest to the southeast where the line is across New Jersey, and they continued to sell property. By the time I started doing research in the late 1980s, the East Jersey records were all in Trenton at the state archives, but it's only been the last probably 10 or 12 years that the West Jersey property records were finally turned over to the state, and you can go there. Otherwise, they actually had an office in Burlington, which was the capital of the West Jersey proprietary, and you had to make an appointment and go there. Now the state does have them, where the other states have also the colonial records.
I think that's a good point for genealogists who are trying to do research. Don't just assume that everything is going to be in one place.
Yes.
In any given state, there's going to be variations on that.
And of course, another type of record is probate records. Wills.
If you were lucky to
back,
get,
yes, it was the more affluent people who have probate records, but they do go back. And there again, you do find that there are other people mentioned in some of them, not just immediate family.
Yeah.
And of course, land, there was transfer fees. Probate, there usually was fees. And the other record is taxes. The colonies tax, the states tax.
I was thinking of that when you were talking about there's no census, but they were collecting taxes. But did those records survive?
For some places they did. For New Jersey, they're almost non-existent. Sharon Hodges, who you know and has been a guest on the show, Sharon and I listened to Barbara Vines Little talk about tax records in Virginia at an NGS conference one year, and we both looked at each other and we said, we got to go see what, they're almost non-existent in New Jersey. I haven't found any actual records. I have found published transcriptions of them. There was a published transcription of Burlington County tax records for a time when my ancestors were in Burlington County, and I looked through them. The one township, Springfield Township, that they were in was the one township the records didn't survive. So I found nothing, and Sharon had a similar experience. Some of the other things are military records. Early on, there was no United States government. There was no federal. So it was the local militia records. And these have, for the most part, survived.
And where do you find those?
And those, everyone that I have looked for, it's been in the state archives.
Okay.
And you want to look at them, particularly the time of the Revolution, because militia units fought locally, but some of them were called to serve in other places. They may have been called up to New York or New England. And so then they go into federal service. So you have records at the federal government level. So you always want to check both of those because you can find, they're going to be different. The militia records are totally going to cover the time when they were local. The federal records are going to cover the time when they went into federal service and wherever they may be. So, it's important to look at both because your ancestor may have records in both types of records.
And then there's the pension requests
Pensions
from that
things
service
like that,
too,
yes.
and that might have, we've
Yes.
always found that to be very
Yes.
valuable.
Yes, and of course maps of the time, because that's going to give you, what the land looked like, but depending on what the maps were done for. They may be land ownership maps, so you can find where your ancestors
Did they name
lived.
the person who?
Often they did.
Would that be the person who owned the grant or subsequent owners?
Well, depending on when the map was
time of
done.
the- yeah.
Maybe the grant, maybe ancestors down the road later. There may be street and road maps and other types of maps. There may be tax maps. So maps are important to take and look at. And with those, it depends on the state. Sometimes you have almost identical collections in both the state archives and the state library. And in other places, you may have a better collection in one or the other. But the other thing for people who are close here in Northern Virginia, the Library of Congress's Map and Geography Room is the largest collection in the world. And although they don't have everything that I have ever looked for, they've had. Most of the time more than I needed as far as maps.
You weren't researching in Texas.
Well, I can't say for every state, but I know that the ones that I have looked for, I've found a good collection.
And the other thing about maps is that borders changed
Yes.
as well, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so you want to make
yeah.
sure that you're looking at a map that's near the area, the time frame.
And
that
I'm going to talk about borders in our next program. And,
All right.
And the last thing to look for is newspapers.
Oh yeah, wonderful.
There were lots of colonial newspapers, and again, it's going to depend on whether they survived or not, and where you may find the best collection. But I always say either the state archives or state library is probably going to have a better collection than, for example, the Library of Congress. Although they have newspapers, they don't have everything. And I found more locally within Pennsylvania and New Jersey, particularly, that the better collection is either the state archives or state library. So check out both.
Huh. Are they digitized? A lot of the colonial papers, have you noticed?
It depends on who owns the newspapers and what they have allowed. I know that the collection in the New Jersey State Archives has not been digitized. But yet some of the papers that they own are digitized because there are other libraries that own the collection or part of the collection and have allowed it to be digitized. So, you know, and another thing I just thought of, don't always stay within the state. There is a newspaper in Camden County, New Jersey that still exists today. It started sometime in the mid-1800s. Well, there's bits and pieces, different places in New Jersey. The Free Library of Philadelphia at their Logan Circle facility has the big collection of start to finish. That has survived. There are some things that are missing, you know, over time, but you know, a few issues here or there. But they have the largest collection in one place.
That's good to know.
So it's better to go to Philadelphia than to run to 4 or 5 places in New Jersey in that case.
What about public sources? I mean, I know when I was researching, I Googled the guy's name, and up pops these old books that were no longer in print, but there's some company that takes these old books and reprints them and sells them. And I found a treasure trove of information.
There are a number of companies that have done that over time. Craig Scott, who owns Heritage Books, who used to live here in Northern Virginia, he has reprinted a number of things. One of the things that he did that I bought was the WPA guide for New Jersey. That was done in the late 1930s or early I forget exactly when it was done, but he republished the guide, and so I actually have not found an original copy of that anywhere that I had looked. And I stopped looking when I got a hold of a copy of it. It was relatively inexpensive to buy. But yeah, anything that is out of copyright, they can do that.
But even the ones that are in the library that deal with these early settlements, there's probably stories and records of the citizens and
one of the best collections to go after is county histories.
Yes.
And you know, a lot of those, my favorite place to go for those locally, if I can't get to New Jersey or to Pennsylvania, is the DAR library. Because they have a large collection of those. And those, depending on who published it, and you know, you find, yes, the wealthier people are mentioned more often, but you have people who are maybe served in the militia or served in the military, and they may have a section listing those men. You know, other things that were going on in the county, the information on the churches and the founding of the churches, and other things, the way the government was organized, the courthouses, when they built a new courthouse, information on that, if anything changed, like the county seat changed, things like that would all be in there. So sometimes you don't necessarily find a lot of information on your individual ancestor, but knowing about the area where they lived, you can get out of those kinds of books.
And those little county histories, you know, sometimes they'll have like a 100-year anniversary or something, and then they'll go back in and talk about the history. And they'll talk about who some of the...
And newspapers also used to do that, where, you know, 100 years ago today, this happened in the county.
But they'll often mention by name some of the people who were, you know, prominent in the community.
And particularly like with churches and things, if they give a history, they may name some of the founding family members. That's how one of my lines ended up in Atlantic County, New Jersey, and it wasn't my third great-grandfather, but although he was a member of the church, but he had 15 children who all lived to adulthood.
Oh, you hate
and
that.
I think it's 4 of the children all were founding members of that church.
Okay.
And of course, it's the church where quite a bit of the family is buried, and including the family name there was Pancoast. So it was on my grandfather's mother's side, but my Mason great-grandparents are buried in that same cemetery, and it's still growing. The church no longer is in operation, but somebody owns the cemetery rights, and they have bought more land behind where the cemetery, and so you can still buy graves and be buried there, and they're still burying people, today.
Oh my gosh. Well, so Chuck, if somebody has an ancestor in this area, what are the sort of the keys for a successful research?
Well, the main thing is knowing about your ancestors, knowing or looking for everything that you can find about the individual and the family, and then spreading out into what we call their fan club.
Fan club.
Their family, their friends, their acquaintances, people who they know, they may do business with, but they're not what you would call a friend, and also the neighbors.
Yes.
Looking at the neighbors. When I got to or found my great-grandparents, third great-grandparents' wills, and I looked at who the witnesses were and who ended up being appraisers on the estate inventory, I knew those people because I knew they were witnessing each other's deeds. I knew from census records they lived close. They were within a few families of where my ancestors were. And really knowing everybody, because you don't know when you might find your ancestor mentioned in somebody else's records. And
neighbors meant a lot more to people in those days than they do today.
Because you didn't have, living out in the country, farmers, you didn't have a lot of stores to go buy things. So this family may raise chickens and somebody else may raise hogs and all, and they would sell meat, they would sell eggs.
But if you needed help, you'd run to the neighbor.
You would have the neighbors coming over to help.
And borrowing some sugar
all kinds of
is
things.
a broad statement for those days.
And of course, it's just something that, like I say, you never know when they may be mentioned in a record.
Yeah.
When I talk about people immigrating and doing naturalization, and particularly when they go to submit that final application for citizenship, there are oftentimes witnesses' statements or affidavits. Well, if your ancestor had so-and-so and so-and-so, witness for them, go look at that person's records because your ancestor may have been a witness for them. And so you get information that, it's not always necessarily going to be something that is going to be really, really helpful, but it makes them human. It puts, a side to them that they were human. They were more than they were born, married, and died.
Right. The other thing about the neighbor thing is, they married. It's a really good chance that they married into those families too.
Yes.
So having that name could lead you to an in-law at least.
Particularly for women, because, I don't know about you, but when I started out, and I've whittled it down, but I had a list of around 15 to 20 women who I didn't have a clue what their maiden name was. And nothing that really helped me. And I've whittled it down, and I still have a few that I haven't been able to. But, they didn't have the opportunities that we have to meet somebody halfway around the country or
Right.
the world.
Yeah, right,
You know,
on the
it was within the neighborhood or the community
Right.
that they most of the time met their spouses. And
probably even that church. If you have the church records, you can
the church was often the place, because as I've said, the church was the social
It's the center. It was,
for our ancestors, at least into the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah, that's true. That's right.
And the other thing is, don't discard that they didn't marry into a family, to a family member.
Right.
It was legal to marry second, third cousins, depending on what the law was and the time frame. I had one case in my Pancoast line where her maiden name was Pancoast. She married a man, I forget what his surname was, and he passed away. She was in her early 50s. Well, she married a Roy Pancoast.
Oh.
And I thought, it's got to be a relative. Took me a little while, but yes, it was one of her second cousins that she married. And this was in the late 50s or early 60s. So,
Well, Chuck, we've just got about a minute left, and so can you briefly just maybe talk about a source, a good source that a researcher could go to? And
the best things that I have found in my research, the National Genealogical Society has research guides for the states. Now, they don't have all 50 done, they're working on it, but they have all 5 of the Mid-Atlantic States guides. In fact, a couple of them, they're in their 2nd and 3rd edition. And also going to FamilySearch.org, because you have access to a lot of records, but you also have the wikis. When I put the original program together, they used to have research guides too.
Right.
Now they've replaced that with the wikis. But those are 2 places that you can start and get a great deal of helpful information.
Chuck, this has been wonderful. Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome.
We appreciate it. And Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, we're still doing virtual, but we hope to open our Holland Hall Center pretty soon. So mvgenealogy.org, come visit us. We have lots of good stuff for you. Thank you for attending today. Thanks, Chuck.
You're welcome.